O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Now, as someone who lived for many, many years in a place much more rural than suburban Boston, Jane Kenyon's poem here captures something absolutely perfect about the creeping in of quiet night that is difficult to know in a place that is never totally dark. I have to admit that as a kid, the coming in of night was not a pleasant one. I was quite fearful of the dark and the quiet, and suddenly realizing that the light of the day was diminishing, that the bright yellows and whites were surrendering to long, stretched oranges and reds, would soon awaken a twisting anxiety of the bottomless blues and blacks that would soon pull over all things. Our yard, our barn, our home, an island of artificial light, that at some point, every night, the last bulb would be switched off, and I would be left floating in an ocean of darkness. As you can tell, I spent far too much time thinking about this as a child. Every evening, there were prayers that night would come and go quickly, praying that God would help me fall asleep instantly and awaken in the morning, having completely missed or forgotten the hours in between. Quite transactionally, I would pray that if God understood my fear, truly knew my worries, that indeed dawn would come quickly, that I would be spared the most terrible thing of all to my 6 or 7-year-old self, which was waking up in the middle of it, in the middle of the dark, when everyone else was asleep and all things were silent, because it was an awful thing in the middle of the woods. And so I prayed, maybe believing somewhere deep down within myself, as Kenyon writes, that God does not leave us comfortless. Now, God makes many promises to Abram throughout his life. Promises for his fortune, promises for his legacy, for his deliverance. Many times, God parts the cloud and comes down close to speak directly with Abram, the favorite human of the moment, it would seem, and extol to Abram all the goodness that was in store for him. And Abram receives all of these promises with relish, because he is a man of just as many worries and fears as there are stories and legends about him that we tell, that billions of people tell. And each time God's voice descends and makes such a promise, Abram replies in his full humanness, "But how will I know?" Not in terms so exact, mind you, but indeed in spirit. He does not reject the promise, he does not question it, but instead has something to the effect of, "God, my God, that is all well and good and a fine promise that you have made me, but how will I know that that has come to pass? Indeed, that your word for me is being made real. How will I know?" And I bet that's a very deflating response to God. That God has come down with a choice gift wrapped in perfect divine love and care, delivered and opened by a favorite child, but there are no oohs or ahs or thank yous. It is simply a, "But how will I know?" And it is in this part that I think makes the love between God and Abram turned Abraham so real and so pure, because Abram is not the only one to question promises made by God. There are many times and many different people in different books where God makes a promise and someone questions God, and it goes a little bit differently than with Abraham. Think Job questioning God on the death of his children and the destruction of his home. When Job questions God, God says, "You question me? You think you understand the ordering of the universe. Gird up your loins like a man, and I will do the questioning. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Then there are the questions that float up to God that seem to receive nothing in reply. At least the texts make it seem so. Consider Jesus in the garden, praying that some other way might be found, and there is only wind in the trees in reply. Sometimes silence is worse than admonishment. But still, these questions come from Jesus, from Job, and from Abram. But Abram's prayer doesn't hit the same chord with us, perhaps, as us modern folks, what it is that he is looking for: an heir, a child. Abram's prayer for a child and insistence on proof, it doesn't come from things that we might identify with. It doesn't come from Abraham's desire for a happy, full home, though he will experience that. Nor is it for the fulfillment of his longing to be a parent, which he will experience that too. Abram's desire, need for proof, is a deep, fearful, existential prayer about his identity and his place in the cosmos. Because that is what a child, an heir, would do. Prove that. That all that has begat Abram up to this point is satisfied and approving of his stewardship of it, and therefore sees it good to begat again. But with no heir, Abram does not know whether he has done right by his people, his ancestors, his God. It is a twisting anxiety that dogs at him, riding on every breath, in the corner of every thought, until his son is born. The worry of his smallness, of his insignificance, of his pointlessness. It sits like the whole world on his chest. And so he prays, and so he questions, God, you have told me that I matter. You have told me that I am worthy, that I am good, but how will I know that that is true? And God, quite beautifully, takes Abram by the hand and leads him out into the deep, bottomless blues and blacks of night, and tells him to look into the heavens, into their vastness, and to not fear the worry. Do not fear the terror of smallness and insignificance that it sends up his spine. To not fear what your mind is telling you is just bleak emptiness up there, but instead to look with the courage of faith and see, in fact, that the bottomless night is actually filled to the brim and overflows with light that falls just as faithfully as the sun in the day. You just have to have faith that your eyes will adjust to see it. In order to see it, in order to be assured and blessed by it, though we ourselves are filled to the brim and overflowing with prayers and worries and anxieties of the failing light of every day, in order to live through them, in order to not become stranded in them, knotted by fear and doubt, in order to look up and see the innumerable blessings of stars, we must steal the courage and faith we have and let it descend upon us. Because without sometimes the gift of that worry, the gift of that dark, we would not have the eyes to see the blessings that are hanging over our heads perpetually, to see them, to know them, and be comforted by them. In order to do that, we must let evening come sometimes. Amen.